This episode is brought to you by LifeLock. The new year brings new health goals and wealth goals. Protecting your identity is an important step. LifeLock monitors millions of data points per second. If your identity is stolen, LifeLock's restoration specialist will fix it, guaranteed or your money back. Resolve to make identity health and wealth part of your New Year's goals with LifeLock. Save up to 40% your first year. Visit LifeLock.com/podcast. Terms apply.
Bored with your boring cardio? Stop pedaling that snooze cycle to Nowheresville and try some cardio that's actually fun. Supernatural Fitness, available on MetaQuest. Isn't that right, Jane Fonda?
Cardio will never be boring again.
Sweat to the beat of thousands of chart-topping songs inside stunning virtual landscapes.
Bet your stationary bike can't do that.
Visit GetSupernatural.com and join the next fitness revolution. Supernatural VR Fitness, only on MetaQuest. Rated Teen for Teen.
There's a long list of things that Donald Trump has said he'll do on day one of his new administration. He said he'll settle the war in Ukraine, close the border, begin the largest deportation program in U.S. history. And then there's this.
You've promised to end birthright citizenship on day one. Is that still your plan?
Yeah, absolutely.
Birthright citizenship is guaranteed by the Constitution. Ending it would mean being born here wouldn't give you any special rights or privileges. No social security number, no passport. You'd be from the U.S., but not of here.
You know, if somebody sets a foot, just a foot, 1 foot, you don't need to, on our land, congratulations, you are now a citizen of the United States of America. Yes, we're going to end that because it's ridiculous.
Executive action.
For Isabela Dias from over at Mother Jones, this idea of eliminating what so many see as a bedrock American principle, it raises a lot of questions.
So I was just curious to see if that's something he could actually try and pull off.
Yeah, because for so long, I feel like people just said like, oh, but you can't do that.
Right. And I think there is, a level of skepticism that is warranted here. So the question then is, can he do that? Can he restrict birthright citizenship through presidential action alone? So essentially with, the stroke of a pen.
Something I've been struck by is the fact that Donald Trump has been talking about revoking birthright citizenship basically forever, like a decade almost. And what's really evolved is how people around him see the effort. Like you found this clip from 2015 when he was running for president before he became president.
The strongest part of your immigration plan, in my opinion, is the wall.
Donald Trump's talking to Bill O'Reilly on Fox News.
So I support the wall. But then you say, well, we got to have mass deportations. That's not going to happen because the 14th Amendment says if you're born here, you're an American and you can't kick Americans out. And then if you wanted to deport the people already here, each and every one are entitled to due process.
Yeah. And O'Reilly basically pushes back and says, this is a ridiculous plan. This is completely, irrational. Like, you can't actually do that.
Bill, I think you're wrong about the 14th Amendment. And frankly, the whole thing with anchor babies and the concept of anchor babies, I don't think you're right about that. I think
can
it's
quote
going to
it.
be
You want me to
proven that you're
quote you the
wrong.
amendment? If you're born here, you're an American. Period. Period.
But there are many lawyers are saying that's not the way it is in terms of this. What happens?
And I think it's interesting that, in true Trump fashion, he is not convinced by that. He believes that the children of undocumented immigrants, even if they were born in the United States, that they should not receive automatic citizenship. And then he goes on to say that he thinks that there are a lot of lawyers who would agree with him.
Part of what I was going to ask you was, Donald Trump has been talking about this a long time. Given that Trump didn't even attempt to overturn birthright citizenship last time he was president, what makes you think this time is going to be different?
As I was reporting on this, and talking to legal scholars and experts, one point that they made, and that I think it's important for us to keep in mind, is there has been a change in the legal landscape, right? Trump was able to appoint several judges to the federal bench and, of course, to the Supreme Court. But I think another change is the change in the public opinion. There has been a very significant rightward shift in public opinion, about immigrants, and that could open the gates for a more assertive attempt to undermine birthright citizenship.
Today on the show, the Trump plan to end birthright citizenship. I'm Mary Harris. You're listening to What Next? Stick around. This episode is brought to you by Washington Wise. Decisions made in Washington affect your portfolio every day. But what policy changes should investors be watching? Listen to Washington Wise, an original podcast for investors from Charles Schwab, to hear stories making news right now. Host Mike Townsend, Charles Schwab's managing director for legislative and regulatory affairs, takes a nonpartisan look at the stories that matter most to investors, including the policy initiatives for retirement savings, taxes and trade, inflation fears, the Federal Reserve, and how regulatory developments can affect companies, sectors, and even the entire market. Mike and his guests offer their perspective on how policy changes could affect what you do with your portfolio. Download the latest episode and follow at schwab.com/WashingtonWise or wherever you listen. This podcast is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. You chose to hit play on this podcast today. Smart choice. Progressive loves to help people make smart choices. That's why they offer a tool called Auto Quote Explorer that allows you to compare your Progressive car insurance quote with rates from other companies. So you save time on the research and can enjoy savings when you choose the best rate for you. Give it a try after this episode at Progressive.com. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Not available in all states or situations. Prices vary based on how you buy. Can we talk about where the legal right to birthright citizenship comes from? Like, how did it become part of America's legal framework?
Yeah, it actually goes back to English common law and this principle of jus soli, which basically means citizenship by place of birth. And so the 14th Amendment has this clause, that is the citizenship clause, and it specifically says that all persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States. And of course, as a little bit of a background, the 14th Amendment was ratified right after the Civil War, and notably so, to overrule that infamous Supreme Court decision in 1857, the Dred Scott case, which had ruled that African Americans couldn't be citizens of the United States.
So this is about giving people of color full citizenship.
Exactly. The 14th Amendment, and specifically the citizenship clause, played a huge role in defining citizenship, extending it to Black Americans, and then fostering essentially equality in a nation of formerly enslaved people.
When it comes to immigration, the 14th Amendment was really bolstered by Supreme Court precedent, though, right? Like, you've reported on this 1898 case, the Wong Kim Arc decision, that is really seen as the foundation of birthright citizenship for immigrants specifically. Can you just walk me through this case and why it's so foundational here?
Yeah, so Wong Kim Arc was born in San Francisco, California, to Chinese immigrant parents. His parents had been living in the United States for many years, but, if you remember, that was a time of very, very intense anti-Chinese animus and hate. And so the Chinese Exclusion Act, which was, a bunch of anti-Chinese laws, meant that Wong Kim Arc's parents, they couldn't become naturalized citizens of the United States. So they were, relegated to essentially being residents for all of the time. And so at one point, they decided that they were just going to go back to China. And so when Wong Kim Arc was in his early 20s, he was working as a cook in California. California was his home, but he would kind of travel back and forth to China to see his family. And he did that a few times without any sort of problem, coming back into the country.
Well, and in your reporting, he was really meticulous about maintaining his documents, making sure he had letters that showed he could be in the United States. This is his home.
Exactly. He had statement of departure, that, and an affidavit that had to be signed by white man, attesting to the fact that he, was born in the United States and could come and go. And so, yeah, he was very much prepared. But then on this one occasion, in 1895, when he was just arriving back at the San Francisco port on this steamship, he was basically denied entry by the custom officials at the time. And the basis for that denial was, they were saying that he wasn't a U.S. citizen and that therefore he could be, sent back to China, that he wouldn't be allowed into the country. And they actually kept him aboard the ship for 5 months.
And the customs official here had a history of racism, right?
Absolutely. They were very much open about their anti-Chinese, bias, and talked about how they thought that Chinese immigrants and Chinese descendants, they weren't incapable of assimilating. So that was the underlying, idea there. And they were looking for a test case to challenge birthright citizenship. And so they thought that they have found that in Wong Kim Arc.
So they wanted a fight.
Yeah, they take this to the courts. Wong Kim Arc actually filed a petition challenging his wrongful detention and, asserting that he was indeed a U.S. citizen under the 14th Amendment. And so this case, goes to federal court, and a district court judge actually sides with Wong Kim Arc and finds that, it was enough that he was born in this country, so he is a U.S. citizen, regardless of the status of their parents.
What happens when this case gets to the Supreme Court?
So in March 1898, the Supreme Court justice ruled in a 6-2 decision that Kim Arc was a citizen. And the decision specifically states that the 14th Amendment affirms the ancient and fundamental rule of citizenship by birth within the territory. So the Supreme Court issued that decision, and it was very definitive about it. And I think one really important part of that was that even though that was obviously a conservative and, racist Supreme Court, that they were not willing to cross the line on that. And one of the reasons is because they raised the question of then what? If we had come to a different conclusion, that would mean that we would have to deny and strip away citizenship from, countless people of Scottish, British, and other European descent that have, for all intents and purposes, been citizens of this country for a really long time.
Yeah, it's interesting. You say that this court wasn't exactly woke. And I think you can tell that by looking at the fact that just 2 years before, they ruled in Plessy v. Ferguson, and that had ushered in the Jim Crow era. But despite that, this ruling, it was a 6-2 decision that is pretty definitive. Given that the court that enshrined the right to birthright citizenship for immigrants to this country was quite anti-minority, quite conservative, why would Donald Trump and his allies and legal advisors think this precedent was ripe to be overturned now?
So I think that, like I said, there has for a very long time been, some conservative scholars who believe that Wong Kim Arc was actually wrongfully decided. And not only they disagree with the conclusion that they arrived at, but they also think that the ruling doesn't specifically address the question of the children of undocumented immigrants, because Wong Kim Arc's parents were lawful residents, that, that case then only applies to the children of lawful immigrants. And so they use that as a reasoning to try and, invite potentially the Supreme Court to narrow the Wong Kim Arc ruling. But, we are talking about challenging centuries of tradition, legal precedent, and essentially a bedrock principle of America's democracy. And it is a matter of settled law. But I guess that never stopped Trump from trying.
After the break, how exactly Trump plans to overturn this precedent. This episode is brought to you by Washington Wise. Decisions made in Washington affect your portfolio every day. But what policy changes should investors be watching? Listen to Washington Wise, an original podcast for investors from Charles Schwab, to hear stories making news right now. Host Mike Townsend, Charles Schwab's managing director for legislative and regulatory affairs, takes a nonpartisan look at the stories that matter most to investors, including the policy initiatives for retirement savings, taxes and trade, inflation fears, the Federal Reserve, and how regulatory developments can affect companies, sectors, and even the entire market. Mike and his guests offer their perspective on how policy changes could affect what you do with your portfolio. Download the latest episode and follow at schwab.com/WashingtonWise or wherever you listen.
Bored with your boring cardio? Stop pedaling that snooze cycle to Nowheresville and try some cardio that's actually fun. Supernatural Fitness, available on MetaQuest. Isn't that right, Jane Fonda?
Cardio will never be boring again.
Sweat to the beat of thousands of chart-topping songs inside stunning virtual landscapes.
Bet your stationary bike can't do that.
Visit GetSupernatural.com and join the next fitness revolution. Supernatural VR Fitness, only on MetaQuest. Rated Teen for Teen.
Slate Money is a weekly discussion of the most important stories in the world of business and finance. Over the past 10 years, we've become known as the place to go if you want to understand what's going on in business, or if you just want to laugh at some of its successes. So if you want a podcast that doesn't turn CEOs into heroes, listen to Slate Money with me, Felix Salmon, and my co-hosts Emily Peck and Elizabeth Spires every Saturday morning, wherever you get your podcasts.
Let's talk about how Donald Trump would actually go about ending birthright citizenship, because it's not as easy as flipping a switch. He's talked about an executive order on day one. What would that executive order say?
So he has said that on day one, he would issue this executive order that would instruct federal agencies to stop issuing passports and social security numbers to children born in the U.S. unless one of the parents is a legal permanent resident or a U.S. citizen. So you can see how that would, for example, exclude the child of, immigrants who are here with temporary, work visas and things like that.
And then presumably a family who is denied a passport or social security number for their child would sue, and then that case would start crawling its way up to the Supreme Court?
Right. There is no world in which this won't trigger legal challenges. And, I've talked to people with very different opinions about, what that would mean if, the Supreme Court actually decided to take this on. I think some people are very skeptical that they would even, entertain this. But then others seem to think that, there are maybe 2 or even 3 justices who might be open to a challenge like that. And then, of course, Trump might have the opportunity in his next term to appoint new justices. So we'll have to see.
It's worth noting that at At their confirmation hearings, Supreme Court justices have been asked about this precedent for a while. Like Justice Sam Alito was asked whether he thought the children of undocumented immigrants qualified for birthright citizenship under the 14th Amendment. This is 2006. He refused to answer on the grounds that a future case might come before him. Justice Amy Coney Barrett was asked, too. She also declined to respond.
Yeah, I was, very curious to see if any of the current justices had sort of openly addressed this question, and if that we could find any hints of how they might respond, if this came before them. And found that Alito was indeed asked, specifically if he agreed that all persons basically mean all persons in the 14th Amendment, and that, to deny citizenship to the U.S.-born children of undocumented parents would be constitutional or unconstitutional. And like you said, he kind of evaded the question, but acknowledging that he's aware that there are active legal disputes about the meaning of that provision. And he was like, if this question came before me as a sitting justice, it kind of would come down to whether there is a compelling argument or a frivolous argument or something in between. So didn't entirely close the door, right, to ruling on this question.
Well, and we've seen justices talk about the importance of precedent, for instance, with Roe v. Wade, and then change their mind.
Yeah, the current Supreme Court has given us evidence that they aren't opposed to revisiting landmark cases. And I think, Roe v. Wade is obviously a very well-known case, whereas Wong Kim Arc has kind of, I feel like, sort of been under the radar. It's definitely a lesser-known case, but it's by no means not a landmark decision. And like we talked about, just, with monumental importance to this country. I actually talked to a historian who described, if it weren't for Wong Kim Arc, basically this nation wouldn't be a country of immigrants. It would actually be a country of foreigners and, of people who would be destitute of basic rights. So that's how big of a precedent it is. And it's still good law, as far as most people seem to think that, at least.
But even if the Supreme Court wasn't game to completely overturn Wong Kim Arc, there is another route they could go. The 14th Amendment Citizenship Clause does include some exceptions for the children of foreign diplomats and the children of foreign invaders during a hostile occupation. It's that last one that Trump associates have seized on.
And so some of these opponents of birthright citizenship argue, well, all of these unauthorized migrants coming through the border would be perpetrators of an invasion of the U.S. territory. And if these people are therefore, quote unquote, invaders, then their children should be excluded from the 14th Amendment's birthright citizenship guarantee. Now, this invasion argument, even without being connected to birthright citizenship, is kind of a far-fetched argument. The courts so far haven't been necessarily open to that. But there is an indication that at least one federal judge would be open to that line of argument, and his name is James Ho. He was appointed by Trump to the conservative Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals.
He's someone who's often talked about as a potential Supreme Court nominee, right?
Right. There is this feeling that he's kind of auditioning for a potential Supreme Court vacancy. And, he's someone who actually in 2006, interestingly enough, he wrote this article, in defense of birthright citizenship for the children of undocumented immigrants. He very adamantly wrote that birthright is protected no less for children of undocumented persons than for descendants of Mayflower passengers.
So what changed?
He has since changed his tone very much. In a recent interview, he said that birthright citizenship obviously doesn't apply in the case of war or invasion. And so he was kind of nodding at that argument of immigration as an invasion and therefore a disqualifier for birthright citizenship. So I thought that was, obviously notable and perhaps concerning.
I know that some scholars have said if this case or a case like this went to the Supreme Court, maybe there's 2 or 3 justices who would want to get rid of birthright citizenship. But it takes more than 2 or 3 justices to overturn precedent, to win a case. So I wonder, what's the evidence that more justices might be interested in this, that the Supreme Court really might be looking to do something as major as reassess birthright citizenship?
It's really hard to, predict or anticipate how the justices might respond to this. As of now, I would think that most of the justices would be very, very careful and hesitant to change this, and would probably be aware of the magnitude of this. But I think one important point is that, even if this challenge, whatever it looks like, sort of just dies in the courts, I think this is still very much needs to be taken seriously. It sends a message about who Trump thinks should get to benefit from being American, right? It's about an exclusionary vision for the country. And I think that in and of itself is very dangerous. There are an estimated 5 million children of unauthorized immigrants who were born in the United States. So we're talking about, if this was to be made policy going forward, just creating this entire underclass of people who won't have the same rights, equal protection, and all that comes with being an American, and would have to essentially live in the shadows. You wouldn't be able to work, wouldn't be able to vote, certainly. So the idea that that would be good policy is something that honestly kind of astounds me.
Is there any way birthright citizenship is challenged in this country without the Supreme Court? Does this have to move through the Supreme Court, essentially?
You would have to amend the Constitution, right? Which is an incredibly burdensome process, and it would be very unlikely.
Going through the courts sounds easier to me.
Yeah, I don't think any of it will be easier, and that's a good thing.
Isabela, thank you so much for coming on the show. I'm grateful for your time and reporting.
Thank you, Mary.
Isabela Dias reports on immigration over at Mother Jones. And that's our show. What Next is produced by Paige Osburn, Elena Schwartz, Rob Gunther, Anna Phillips, and Madeline Ducharme. We are led by Alicia Montgomery. Ben Richmond is the Senior Director of Podcast Operations here at Slate. And I'm Mary Harris. Go track me down on Blue Sky if you'd like. I am at Mary Harris. Thanks for listening. Talk to you soon.